The U.S. was a developing country in Bagehot's day. And as a consequence, the need for long-term finance to build the railroads, to build buildings, to build factories, to build homes, you know, the need for long-term finance was extreme. Okay. And so the banks acceded to that. The banks made long-term loans. The banks held corporate bonds. They made these kinds of loans on land, you know, all kinds of long-term loans. They didn't confine themselves to short-term discounts the way the British banks did. Okay, so an American bank looked like this. Okay, they had bonds. Okay, they had loans. Sometimes these loans, to sort of prettify their balance sheet, might say they're 6-month loans, but if you looked more carefully at them, they were never intended to be paid back. They were 6-month loans, which 6 months from now would be renegotiated and extended and rolled over. So they had long-term loans essentially, and long-term bonds, and they didn't have many short-term bills at all. Okay, in Bagehot's day. So how could they be banks? You know, how did they manage? You know, if this is the theory of banking, that you need to have liquidity by having short-term bills, how did they manage? They managed by holding reserves, cash reserves, but also by having a sophisticated system of interbank borrowing and lending. Remember, I mentioned these bankers' balances, correspondent balances, bankers' balances. Okay. And so let's suppose that this is a deficit bank. So it has to make a payment to another bank. So this is where the liquidity comes in. Surplus bank here. Okay, and so that surplus bank, let's say they both have deposits here. Okay, the surplus bank also has bonds and loans and cash reserves. Okay, and let's suppose that the surplus bank actually is the issuer of these bankers' balances. So these are like a deposit. I'm talking here about the American system before there was a central bank. So that's even more of a trouble, right? Not only do they have all these long-term things, so their liquidity is an issue, but they don't even have a central bank. They can't go to the central bank when they need extra reserves. They have to rely on each other, on other banks only. And here's how they did it. If the deficit bank needs to make a payment to the surplus bank, it's either paying in cash, it's either paying in bankers' balances, or, very interestingly, it is doing some interbank borrowing through, essentially, repo. What they did was to use these bonds as collateral for borrowing from other banks. And that basically is what a repo is. Okay, a repo is a paired sale purchase of an asset, but it's a way of borrowing secured from someone else, where you transfer this collateral to them, and then when you pay back the loan, you get the collateral back. Okay, so these were they weren't sophisticated repos like today, but it was basically the economics of it. It was some kind of repurchase agreement. So if there was a payment, it would be either plus cash here minus bankers' balances on this side, or plus repo here.
Yes. Yeah, this is, I guess, more historical, but if the U.S. was a developing nation at the time, and this was a common trend where a lot of people would need to take long-term loans, then presumably a lot of these banks would be deficit banks. Did the central bank come in and serve as the surplus bank here? Or
there was no central bank.
So was it just the case that...
When I say deficit bank, what I mean is if, for example, this bank, people are withdrawing their deposits or moving them here, that means that bank has to make a payment to the surplus bank. Okay, so it's not about the whole system being in deficit. The way banks made loans for long-term loans is the way banks always make loans, which is by expanding their balance sheet, by saying, here's a loan, I'm going to create to your credit a deposit account, and then you're going to pay me back here, a loan here. So it's not, they don't need to borrow the funds from the central bank or anything like that. That's not the sense in which they're a deficit bank. They're a deficit bank at the clearing, so that if the person who gets that loan spends it to buy stuff, from New York, okay, that deposit gets transferred to New York, and now this bank has a problem. How can I pay the New York bank where this is being? And so you're either transferring reserves, okay, or you're using some of the banker's balances in your correspondent money center bank, but those are also like reserves. Or, if need be, you take this bond and you use it as collateral to borrow the reserves back, basically, so that you don't need to transfer any reserves. So it's an interbank borrowing market. There's something even more interesting about this. You've heard the rating agencies. You've heard a lot about rating agencies, right? With the shadow banking, that somehow they put AAA on stuff that was garbage and so forth. The origin of the rating agencies is in this period, okay, of American history, before there was central banking, because the banks are having to make payments to each other. They don't want to do credit analysis on every single one of these bonds, right? And so they hire these rating agencies. The rating agencies spring up to say, okay, we're going to tell you these bonds are unlikely to default in the next year. Okay, I think they'll be current on their payment in the next year. Not saying that these are good assets forever, but that if you do a short-term, use them as collateral short-term, you're probably going to be okay, or not, okay? And so the rating of the bond went into the terms of the repo and all of that. So the rating agencies were there to support the fact that we didn't have a discount mechanism, that we didn't have a central bank or anything like that. That's what they were for. That's where they originated, okay? And they were originally, you would, if you were one of these banks, if you were any bank, okay, you would pay Moodys and you'd get a big book that listed all the bonds. And so if somebody is offering you a bond as collateral, you just look up in your book and you say, oh, there it is. Okay, well, so therefore, here's how much money I'll lend you against. So it made it so that you didn't have to do any credit analysis. You could just look at Moodys, and it was a way of doing settlement, of using bonds to secure. If you have a relationship with another bank, right, you can use bankers' balances. That's unsecured. This is unsecured borrowing and lending, right? This is secured borrowing and lending. This you can do with some bank in New York that never heard of you, okay? They don't want to know anything about you, but if you give them some railroad bond that's in the Moodys book, okay, fine, they'll lend you money against that. Okay, so this is the origin of rating agencies in the United States. You can see that the capital market and the money market, okay, are completely intertwined here. This is shadow banking. This is sort of shadow banking before the Fed, 19th century shadow banking. And this is what, when every now and then there'd be a crisis. In 1907 there was a crisis, and so when they reformed banking, they said, let's get rid of this system. Let's adopt this system. Okay. Let's say that banks have to use these short-term bills, and we'll have a Fed that will discount these short-term bills. You remember, we talked about all of this. But it never worked because no one was issuing these bills. There were never enough bills. What the U.S. needed long-term finance. Okay. I think you could make an argument that the Fed, the mistake the Fed made in 1929, okay, was that it allowed the shadow banking system to collapse. It thought it was a good thing to let it collapse. This is our chance to get rid of all of this. And we didn't support the shadow banking system. They said, we'll just do the discounts of short-term high-quality bills. That will do. But we're not going to support you if you have mortgage credit or bonds or something like that. That's improper for banks to have. Okay? And as a consequence, they brought down the whole U.S. banking system and, in fact, the world financial system. From this point of view, we are very fortunate in 2007, okay, that the central bank did not say, I'm not going to backstop the shadow banking system. They did backstop the shadow banking system, even though a lot of it was in Europe, as a matter of fact. Okay, this stuff here, you notice there there, I'm showing there's no arrow from the Federal Reserve Bank to the shadow banking system. Okay, the link between the shadow banking system and the Federal Reserve Bank are those red things, liquidity put. Okay, there were liquidity puts between the shadow banking system and Citibank and other traditional banks, and that's how the shadow banking system got onto the balance sheet of the traditional banking system, and that's how it got onto the balance sheet of the Fed. The shadow banking stuff that is good or bad, good cholesterol or bad cholesterol, as Laura Adair Turner says. This is a very old debate, right? The Fed thought that this was bad shadow banking system, and it didn't support it. Okay, the people who created the Fed thought it was a bad shadow banking system, and they tried to create something that didn't actually fit American needs. And so it continued on as it was before. Okay, they pasted a kind of central bank onto the system that operated like this, instead of thinking, how can we have a central bank that will support a system like this? Okay, this is exactly, I think, the moment we are in history now. Okay, where we have to be thinking, how can we have a central bank that supports a system like this? Okay, in a time of crisis, not imagine a world that's not like this. The world is like this. The world is like this today.